Welcome to my home. I'm Dr. Nick Begich, and today's video that we're producing is HAARP and beyond. It's been a long time since we've produced a video on HAARP and really brought out the information in the context of where we are now in 2006 versus where we were when we first disclosed this story in the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP back in 1995. So today's topic will deal with the various aspects of HAARP and talk about what's happened since with some of the key players involved in that research, as well as the political implications and where this technology is going from here. This may be the first time that you've seen a video or gotten familiar with any of our work, so I want to give you a little bit of background on me. I'm Dr. Nick Begich. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines. I come from a political family here in Alaska, second generation of political involvement here. I also have a background in education, being twice elected president of the Alaska Federation of Teachers and the Anchorage Council of Education. I've written 3 books, co-authored with James Roderick and Gene Manning. And am presently the executive director of the Lay Foundation on Technologies, which is involved in researching and educating the public on technology issues. And currently it's providing us a great deal of the research base necessary to produce this video and much of our work into the future. Welcome to my library. I want to start with a little discussion of the Lay Institute on Technology, Inc., which was set up as a Texas nonprofit corporation primarily to educate the public on the impacts of technology. And as a result of that effort and my work with Dorothy Lay, the founder of that foundation, we're able to continue to archive and develop material that's useful for research projects like this and many others. In fact, all that material now is posted on the internet at www.layinstitute.org. And if you go there and you look at the site, there's an area called EPI search, and that is our research index. And so if you go there, you can search any keyword. You can look up HAARP or climate change or radio or microwave or any of the words that are of interest to you, and you'll see every document that we've stored there on those archives available to the public in a way that makes it more useful in researching these issues. So take a look at that. It's useful in conjunction with this production today. But let's get back to the HAARP issue and where that issue began for me. HAARP started really with a very short segment, a little article actually in a magazine called Nexus, an Australian journal. I read the article, and it was about a project taking place here in Alaska called HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. And at that time, it was being operated by the U.S. Navy and Air Force in developing what they called a developmental prototype for weapons applications of a very, very large radio frequency array or field of antennas located here in Alaska. And so, what happened when I read that article is I looked at it and I thought, Alaska is a big place geographically, but when you think about it politically, it's very small. We have a small population. You tend to hear about what's going on, and virtually nothing had been reported in our local media regarding this project. And I'm kind of a curious person, and the article was pretty outrageous in what it was claiming. So I went and looked at what was available first by searching the sources that were cited in that article at our local library, LUSAC, which happens to be one of 78 libraries at that time in the country that were designated as federal repositories, places where any unclassified federal record are either stored or they have to produce it for you for free. So it's an incredible research library here in Anchorage, and as I said, 78 of them around the United States. As a result, we were able to verify all of the sources in that article. That got me pretty concerned, and I went next to talk to Trustees for Alaska, which is one of the larger sort of umbrella environmental groups in Alaska. And my thought was, with the implications of this system, this group certainly had to be following the issue. And surprisingly, they weren't. In fact, they said the Audubon Society was looking at it. So I went over to the Audubon Society in Anchorage and talked to them. They had a very short file on the HAARP project, and basically what they were concerned about was the few hundred of acres of wetlands that were going to be disturbed and they were concerned about the flyway, where birds, migratory birds, were coming across that particular region. But those were their only concerns. There were much, much bigger implications to HAARP. Discovering that virtually nobody was following the issue, it seemed like a very, very important issue to me. And so what I did is I sent a large amount of material, including the technical specifications for the array, to a friend of mine, a physicist, who had the background to take a look at whether or not the claims on this facility were actually real and whether it really was a threat. The conclusion that he and others made was that it was a very significant issue, one that needed some public attention, and they insisted that I write an article about the subject. And so that began, for me, a journey that's now lasted 11 years in dealing with this issue and those things that came out of it. But let's talk about what HAARP can do. As I said, it's an array, a field of antennas. And what it essentially started as was 48. 6 in one direction, 8 in another direction, and these are 72 feet tall with a cross dipole. So they're a column going up and then a cross dipole going like so. And by firing these antennae in a very specific order, you can focus the radio frequency energy, concentrate it to a relatively small area, up in an area above the Earth's surface called the ionosphere. And let me explain sort of where the ionosphere is. You've got to look about 30 miles above the Earth's surface for the very beginnings of the ionosphere, and then it stretches out perhaps as far as 400 kilometers out into space and even further in the upper reaches of the ionosphere. And it acts as an electrical shield, if you will, an energized area of our environment, so that cosmic radiations coming in from the sun and from space hit this layer, and it acts as a filter, filtering out particle streams that would make a life on planet Earth impossible without this. Now, people talk about ozone depletion as a major issue, and it certainly is, and we'll cover that in another video in this series. But let's talk about a hole in the ionosphere, which would be significantly greater than any problem attributed to ozone depletion by comparison. Because of the kinds of radiation, it wouldn't be just ultraviolet radiation, as is the case with ozone. This would be very, very dangerous particle streams that would literally alter the genetic blueprint of the planet. So this is the area that the military is targeting as their research area in the developments of HAARP. And HAARP was originally invented by a guy named Dr. Bernard Eastland, and it was an original concept that he had, and he had had this idea that you could create a shielding effect. And let me talk a little bit about what kind of effect that might be. When you look at the ionosphere as this layer around the Earth, and then if you think of the Earth as also kind of a giant motor that's spinning around, and with that comes magnetic field lines. And these field lines go from the southern part of the poles all the way up, and they wrap around, they come back in at the northern polar regions. And in these polar regions, where those magnetic field lines interact with the atmosphere and oxygen and nitrogen, you get the aurora borealis, or the northern lights. Or in the southern hemisphere, you get the equivalent of our northern lights. And it's where this energy is interacting with the atmosphere. Well, by using these naturally occurring field lines, you can actually manipulate energy coming off the ground, coming off of a field of antennas like what HAARP has in Gokena, Alaska, which is just 250 miles northeast of Anchorage. This facility that was built in the early 1990s has been advanced significantly. It started with 48 antennae. They now have 180 in the array, eventually 360. The idea is, again, to focus that energy. By firing this in a sequence, this array, you can create what's called cyclotron resonance, which would be visually seen as sort of a corkscrewing motion of the energy as it rolls up into the ionosphere, getting more and more concentrated as it goes. Just the opposite of the way radio frequency energy generally works when it comes off of a broadcast antenna where we hear radio programs today. What happens in that case is the energy starts out concentrated, spreads out very, very rapidly, in the same way that light from a flashlight spreads out very rapidly. They follow the same basic principles in physics. But as with light, it can be concentrated in the form of a laser, where that light is concentrated and very, very powerful at far distances. The same is true by analogy with radio frequency energy and the HAARP array. That's what makes it so much different than anything else on the planet. The upper limits of the array in terms of effective radiated power, which is not the input power, but it's the effective radiated power, how that energy actually relates in the environment. In this case, the desired level is 1 billion watts of effective radiated power, a huge amount of energy. And being able to manipulate that energy in a variety of ways for weapons applications. Now, why would they locate a facility like this in Alaska? You remember when I was talking about those magnetic field lines surrounding the Earth? The idea was that if you could send cyclotron resonance, this energy coming off of the radio frequency array, this radio frequency energy in this form up to those magnetic lines of force, they'd corkscrew themselves around them. And instead of the energy flowing north to south, the energy would be using that as a waveguide to go from north to south, the opposite direction. So in this case, what then happens is, as you energize these field lines around the planet, any object passing through them would encounter a huge amount of energy that would disrupt the avionics, the electronics that control the flight path of intercontinental ballistic missiles or anything else in the region, including satellites, low-orbiting satellites, and the like. So the idea was to create this shield. That was number one. The amount of energy that was required was huge. So Dr. Eastland went to ARCO. At that time, Atlantic Richfield had huge natural gas resources on the North Slope of Alaska, ideally suited, according to Eastland's patents, for exploitation for this technology, because natural gas supplies would allow the conversion to electrical energy using magnetohydrodynamic generators, called out in Eastland's patents. And then from there, that electrical energy could be fed into this huge array and then sent up to the ionosphere for the various weapons applications. So the ideal situation presented itself in the early 90s, and it was location within the boundaries of the United States for a ground-based system that in effect, as we go through the day today, you'll see has all of the ramifications that were being sought in the 80s under the old Star Wars concepts. The idea of a global missile shield or protection from adversaries using low-orbiting space platforms and the like. So here we had a technology emerging that could solve those things. For Atlantic Richfield, it was great because there's no gas line presently coming out of Alaska to bring that gas to market. And we've been producing oil from that field for over 30 years, yet we can't get the natural gas. So for ARCO to be able to sell the gas to the military right where it is offered tremendous advantage. So they set up ARCO Power Technologies, Inc., a subsidiary with 30 employees. They originally bid on the HAARP project after selling the concept to the military in the early days, in the late 80s. Dr. Eastland actually put together that original team that became ARCO Power Technologies, Inc. Now what they did as a subsidiary, they had no track record of military contracting. They had really no history at all. They bid for the HAARP construction and applications on that project and won. And who did they bid against? Raytheon Corporation, for one. Raytheon at the time was the 44th largest company in the world, according to Forbes magazine. And they were the inventors of things like the Patriot missiles and some of the new active denial systems being promoted today. In other words, they had real weapons applications and histories, yet this little subsidy, ARCO Power Technologies, won the contract. Now, in public procurement, the way you win those contracts is actually through what's called proprietary information. Certain companies are given extra points and advantage if they hold the technical knowledge necessary to carry a project out. In this case, ARCO Power Technologies, Inc. own those 9 critical patents associated with the HAARP program. And those are cited in the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, along with over 300 military, academic, and mainstream media reports on HAARP. So that's the place if you really want that detailed source material. Get the book, take a look at the bibliographical indexes, also look at the Lay Institute site. The fact is, what happened in all of this development was this excitement from ARCO, because here it was. They were going to make money on gas they could never make money on before. But what happened is the company went through some controversies, some changes. Company eventually sold. Actually, ARCO is no longer here. But the company itself, the subsidiary, was later sold to another organization called E-Systems. And E-Systems was the subject of Washington Post reports back in the early 90s. They predominantly were, at that time, were a $2.1 billion company with the vast majority of their income derived from what are called black projects, projects so secret even the U.S. Congress doesn't know what they're funding. And the citations regarding that are also in the book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP. The point is, this company ends up with the patents and the subsidiary. And what did they do? They sold out. They sold to none other than Raytheon Corporation, the losing bidder on the first project in the beginning. So Raytheon ends up with the intellectual property. They end up with that project, and they later sold to British Aerospace, which is an interesting change of events, and that was in 2003. The project also shifted in 2003 from the Navy and the Air Force over to DARPA, which is the Defense Department's research agency that deals with, again, very, very classified research and projects. But let's go back to what does HAARP really do? Okay, so we've talked about how it focuses energy, but what would you do with that energy when you focus it? There were a number of concepts that Dr. Eastland had. First of all was the issue of communications. The ionosphere, this layer above the Earth, when you think about, if you ever think about shortwave, how it broadcasts around the Earth, it literally strikes the ionosphere and bounces. And that's what allows shortwave to get around the curvature of the Earth and around the horizon. It uses the ionosphere. But when the ionosphere is disturbed, say by really active solar activity, communications are also disturbed. Satellite communications can be disturbed. We know that when the ionosphere is active because the sun is active, that communication systems, even power grids across the planet, can be affected by the way energy is exchanged between the sun and the Earth and the systems within the Earth. So knowing about the ionosphere and controlling it becomes extremely important for communications purposes, and we can all see why the military would be interested in that. What they found is that they could disturb the ionosphere to such an extent using these kinds of systems that they could deny everyone else access to their communication systems. But by controlling those modulations and by controlling those pulse frequencies affecting the ionosphere, they could carry their own communications while denying everyone else access to theirs. Now again, if you can communicate with all of your aspects of your military and you can deny your adversary the ability to do that, we can certainly see the advantages of exploring that whole area. And that doesn't in itself present problems. What presents the problems is when we start manipulating this very important aspect of our environment without really knowing what the long-term consequences of those manipulations might be. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the other applications, because this is sort of a very versatile instrument in terms of how it can be used. And it essentially covers, according to one study that was done by the University of Maryland, it was an executive report for the Congress, and what they did is they looked at sort of what parts of the spectrum could you affect. And everything from ultra-low frequencies to visible light can be affected, which covers 16 decades of frequency, which is a huge, huge range. For those that are technically oriented. Now, HAARP actually operates with its primary frequencies in a little narrow band in the middle of that range. But by manipulating that energy, they can affect this entire range of spectrum. And that's one of the key elements of HAARP. It's not just what it can do in its primary mode of operation, but by pulsing and then modulating a signal on that carrier, you can create much, much different effects. One of the other effects that Dr. Eastland pointed out in his patent was the idea of being used for over-the-horizon radar. Now, this is really interesting because the old technology for the over-the-horizon radar, as things got in close, things would become very distorted so you couldn't see them. And you could really only see things at pretty high elevations. You couldn't see things, for instance, like cruise missiles coming in at those very low ground elevations. With the ability of HAARP and over-the-horizon technology that it offers, you get everything from intercontinental ballistic missiles, those things coming in from, literally coming back in from space, re-entering the atmosphere, all the way down to cruise missile heights, things coming out at a few 100 feet above the Earth's surface and following its contours. And you don't get distortion when it gets close in. Again, we can see the advantages of doing that For that application, you actually need 2 transmitters, and Alaska does have 2. High Pass, located just outside of Fairbanks near the Poker Flats Rocket Range, which is a small array, and then the larger array at Gokana, Alaska, which is, again, 250 miles northeast of Anchorage. Now there, what you can do then is you can literally energize an area of the ionosphere, and it creates what's called a cold plasma, or layer of energy that acts like a reflective mirror. And by moving it around and steering it, you can then send a signal from the other transmitter and bounce it over the curvature of the Earth. So you get this over-the-horizon effect. If you use, again, one of the other patents in this cluster held by ARCO Power Technologies, Inc., is a gamma ray detector designed for satellite-based applications, and utilizing first the HAARP system to create a unique energy pattern around each of the incoming objects, then using gamma ray detectors based on satellites, they could actually determine which of those incoming objects carry nuclear payloads and which ones are simply decoys. Extremely important, because in all nuclear scenarios, except for those by rogue states, we envision 100,000 incoming objects, of which only perhaps a few hundred actually carry nuclear payloads. Now, we don't have the capability of knocking out all of those objects, but if we could isolate the real threats, those that carry nuclear payloads, then obviously an advantage is gained there. So that over-the-horizon application, and then the idea of detecting by the unique energy signature around all those objects. And then the third application in this series was the idea of creating what's called an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, or a surge of energy so strong that it overrides the electronic circuits, those little microcircuits within all of sophisticated electronics and computer systems, overrides them, causing bit errors and computer error that causes those aircrafts to crash. And in some cases, with enough EMP power, you can literally melt circuitry. So 3 phases. If you increase the power sufficiently on the HAARP facility, you can create this EMP effect and knock out everything in the sky. Now, obviously, in a nuclear scenario, we can see the need for something like this, but at the same time, everything else that's in that space or in that range is also going to be knocked out. All the civilian aircraft, that's the collateral damage in such an event, and if we were to use such technology. Now, Alaska is the place where the new system for missile defense is actually being constructed. Let's get back to the issue of missile defense for just a moment, because this is an extremely important aspect of the whole HAARP story, because this is really where it began. You know, when you go back to '95, when we were first publishing on the subject, you know, Gene Manning and I wrote the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, really as a beginning point to get public debate on the issue. I've done thousands of radio broadcasts in the last 11 years on this issue, as well as traveled to Europe 13 times on related issues. Now, at one point, early on in 1997, I got a call from a gentleman, Tom Spencer, and Tom was at that time the environmental chairman of the European Parliament, and he was a conservative from Great Britain. And Tom asked me a lot about HAARP, wanted the information. Apparently someone here in the United States who had heard us on radio, gotten a copy of our book, had forwarded it on to him, and it got his attention. Now, when he made inquiries into the British military about HAARP and related technologies, the answer he kept getting from them was, Tom, stay out of this. Don't get involved. And for Tom Spencer, that was really the wrong answer. In fact, it was his ticket to the dance, because it got him very involved in this issue. We began a dialogue, and he brought myself and a friend of mine, a physicist, over to actually Brussels, where we were able to meet with him and other parliamentarians and others involved in military-related issues. And we also were able to form an association between the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Conservatives around the HAARP issue, largely because of the work of Tom Spencer. Now, in the interim, several things started to happen. Tom brought us into a couple of different venues, and I want to tell the story because it's a big part of sort of how this thing started to shape. He brought us in to a number of venues, and the first one was one on Arctic issues by the organization called GLOBE, and this was an organization composed of 200 federally elected or nationally elected legislators from 44 governments from around the world, dealing primarily with environmental related issues. And this was an opportunity to talk about HAARP within that forum. Right after our presentation, we were approached by members of the Russian Duma. Now, this is going back to 1997-98 time frame. They approached us, were very interested in the issue because Russians actually, the Soviets back in the 70s, had utilized very similar systems. In fact, if you go back, there was a signal that was reported by shortwave broadcasters as the woodpecker signal, and it was this irritating noise that they would pick up on shortwave broadcasts. They triangulated the positions back to 5 transmitters in the former Soviet Union that were responsible for creating those signals. Those were the early predecessors to HAARP, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. But in the European Parliament, Tom Spencer then became chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the most powerful committee, or one of the most powerful in the European Parliament. He then was able to bring us back to testify in the Security and Disarmament Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee on the issue of HAARP. And what eventually happened is several sections were included in a European Parliament resolution on disarmament, specifically addressing the problems associated with HAARP. And what we were able to demonstrate there are many of the applications and uses by presenting non-classified military documents as well as the planning documents from the facility, and in tracing and showing the history of this facility. The Europeans acted, as did later the Russians in 2002 when they passed their own similar resolution. The problem, going back to that testimony in the European Parliament in February of '98, was one issue that we raised where they had strong objections. And we had said in that hearing that the United States would unilaterally abandon the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistics Missile Treaty with the former Soviet Union, considered one of the anchors in world peace globally by Europeans and our traditional allies as well as our adversaries. The idea that we would abrogate that without cluing in our traditional allies in Brussels and throughout Western Europe, they just couldn't accept. The fact is, we had said it would happen within a year. We were off by 3 months. It was 3 months later that the United States began their moves, which eventually led to the abandonment of that treaty. This was done under both the Clinton administrations and the Bush administrations. Even though Clinton had said he would never support this kind of move, he in the end, in fact, did. What happened then is a lot of concerns because we were so right on in terms of our predictions of what was going to happen. We even gave them the rationale that the senior senator from Alaska, Ted Stevens, would use, which was, there is no Soviet Union, therefore there is no treaty. That's what he said on the floor of the United States Senate in the prelude to the abandonment of that treaty.